Okay, team, we've got a very special guest today from our co-working space. His name is Dave Edwards. Dave, welcome to the Arrive and Thrive Career Podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Ty.
Stoked to have you on, mate.
Yeah, cool.
Please introduce yourself to our listeners and what you do.
Sure, yeah. As you said, Dave Edwards. I grew up in the country in Victoria, in Sale. Voted the most boring town in Australia a couple of times, I think. And couldn't wait to get out of there, really. And then moved up to Melbourne, went to university and started a career in the surveying industry.
Yep.
Focused on a part of it called the Hydrographic Surveying, which is underwater surveying. And that's taken me all over the place. Worked all over the world, throughout Southeast Asia a lot, and now I'm back home in lovely Mornington and enjoying life here.
Mate, so much I want to unpack with you, especially when we were having that brief conversation in the getting coffees a couple of weeks back.
Sure.
What drew you to, I'm going to butcher this name too, the Hydrographic Surveying? Yeah,
so as a kid, I probably got my old man to thank for it. He loved taking me fishing.
Yep.
So I loved being out in the water, in the Gippsland Lakes, offshore there, catching fish. And when I was at school, I guess, I realised I wanted to do something that was sort of working outside. I didn't want to be stuck in an office. I was reasonably handy with maths and science. And so when the careers counsellor came to me and said, "What do you want to do?" I told him all that, and he said, "I considered being a surveyor." So yeah, it sounds like a pretty reasonable sort of job. Surveyors do a whole lot of things, which I didn't know at the time. They peg out subdivisions, control construction of high-rise towers and skyscrapers. They work with satellites and they work underwater as well. I didn't know really any of that, so ducked off to university and thought, yeah, this is all right. I guess the sort of click moment came when I was sort of about my third year of university and sort of had a part-time job working for a land survey company in Melbourne. It was the middle of summer. It was about 38 degrees. I was out in north somewhere right up in the northern end of Melbourne pegging out subdivisions. The ground's rock hard and I'm banging in pegs there, and I was like, there's got to be something better than this, right?
Yeah.
I've got a couple of things. I was working outdoors. I was working with my hands, using my maths, but there's got to be something better. And then I guess I think in the final year of uni, I got an internship with the Port of Melbourne. They had their own hydrographic surveying team here in Melbourne that maps all the shipping berths and shipping channels. So that was sort of a couple of months over summer, much better than banging in pegs in North Reservoir, wherever I was. So sort of that was, then I finished uni and I thought, it's definitely a lot easier than banging in pegs and sounds good. After that, I think in the old days, pre-email basically it was, there was like a notice board at the university, like an old-fashioned notice board, and finishing fourth or fifth year uni and notice a yellow post-it note sort of sitting on the thing saying, who wants to do something different? You want a career where you can travel, work offshore. And I was like, that sort of sounds like me. And knew a bit about it. There's a couple of other guys in university as well. They also applied for it. And I think 3 of us from the university all got a job working in Singapore for a company called Fugro.
Wow.
And those guys worked in the offshore industry doing seabed mapping and construction offshore. And that was sort of what where it sort of started, and then it went from there.
Mate, what a sliding door moment with the yellow post-it note to like...
there was a couple of moments. One was just banging in the pegs, right? I was just driving home, just covered in sweat and dirt and dust, and I was like, shit, this has got to do something better than this. I can't do this for the next 30 years.
Yeah, fascinating. And then you've moved from Sale to Melbourne, and then you've gone from Melbourne to Singapore for this opportunity in your 5th year or directly after?
It was a 5th year, so I did 5 years of uni. It was like a double degree, I think. So, geomatics, which used to be called surveying, and environmental science, I think it was.
Yep.
Went to Singapore. The company, the work was all offshore, so it wasn't actually in Singapore. You sort of sit there in Singapore for a couple of weeks. They'd train you up on their equipment, what the hell was going on. And then they'd throw you on a boat, right, with a team of, 8 or 10 other guys, and you might be installing pipelines, or my first jobs were were surveying patches of seabed where they were going to do some drilling, make sure that measure the depth and make sure the seabed was clear before drilling rigs came in.
Yep.
So like the first year I did was mostly you'd work offshore for 6 weeks or 2 months, something like that. Sometimes on one boat, sometimes you'd just be thrown around between different jobs in different areas. I think the first jobs I worked on were in Thailand and Vietnam. Pretty interesting places.
Yep.
Especially for 22-year-old kid coming out of sail, pretty green. And then after you'd done your 2 months sort of swing, you come back to Singapore and you could do what you want, right? You had basically like a month off. So you could stick around in Singapore and eat noodles and drink beer, or you could go travelling.
Yep.
You come back to Australia and like I said, I think there was 3 guys from our uni class all got into that career. A couple of them, decided they'd go back to Australia and chill out there. And me, I had my girlfriend. We travel around Asia and then come back, sort of check in for work a month later and go and do it all again.
Yeah, cool. And that cycle, like I'm assuming you get used to that, and certain personalities are drawn towards that 2 months on, 1 month off, going from like offshore to onshore.
That's right.
Working environments.
Yeah, it's not for everyone, but it does, particularly when you're young and you don't have too many ties and responsibilities back home. You don't have kids and things like that. It's a really good lifestyle. It gave me the opportunity to travel throughout Southeast Asia. I spent a lot of time in Singapore, living and soaking up that culture there, and learning a lot. So yeah, it does. And then while you're offshore, you've got one job.
Yep.
You've got one task, one project to focus on. You don't have, different emails coming in from different jobs. And so that's really quite refreshing compared to say now where you've got, 10 jobs or 10 different departments coming in and asking you to do stuff. So it's actually quite nice now to go offshore, although I don't do it anymore.
Yep.
When you do go offshore, you turn your computer off and you've got one task, one team to work with and one project. So yeah, it is quite a good lifestyle, and it's quite a clean lifestyle when you're offshore. You're not partying, you're working for 12 hours and you're sleeping for 12 hours. You get a lot of sleep.
Yep.
And you come back, you might come out back after your 2 months a little bit worn out, missing your friends and family, thirsty for a beer, but you're not really tired out. You've worked hard.
Yep.
You've had a lot of sleep, a lot of rest, seen a few things, and there's time for a spell. And I've got a month off, and I can do whatever I want.
Yeah, cool. So a typical day would be like you start at say 7 a.m, finish at 7 p.m. with like a break in between. I'm assuming, and then some downtime, and then
that's right.
Jump into
So
bed.
when I started, which was 25 years ago, it's not quite the same as what it is now. But if you're working on a big ship like I was in my early days, you'd be working, and it still is like this. You work 6 till 6, or possibly 12 till 12. There's meals and things on board the ship. The ship's staying offshore for 2 or 3 weeks at a time.
Yep.
So they've got cooks on board. You'd be sharing a cabin. So when you're off, when you're not working, you might be sharing it with one other person, or more likely back in those days, 3 other people. So it might be a 4-person cabin.
Yep.
Typically, it's pretty much all men, all blokes back then.
Yep.
It's changed a bit now. And when you were doing your 12 hours work, that's all you did. So what I would be doing as a surveyor would be monitoring the position of the ship, all the sensors that they're towing, making sure they're not going to crash into the seabed or a structure, making sure the data is recorded, is good quality.
Yep.
And you typically, like I said, you'd be working in a team of about, say, six or 7 people per shift.
Yep.
So you've got 5 or 6 other guys working there. You've got someone to cover you when you go downstairs get a feed, get some lunch, then you come back up. Sort of 5:30 would come around at the end of your shift. The other guy who is going to replace you would come up. You'd have a little handover in front of the computers. You'd say what had happened in the last shift. This is what you've got to look out for, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
He'd sort of take over. You'd sit with him for another half an hour. Then you'd disappear and go and get some food. And after that, there wasn't really a whole lot to do, right? Didn't have Netflix, didn't have internet on board.
No PlayStations, anything like that.
Yeah, they had lots of Filipino karaoke DVDs and things like that.
Cool.
But you just take you might take half a dozen books with you.
Yep.
And you go back to your cabin, read a book. If you're like me, I'd read about 2 pages, then fall asleep. And you get in a good 10 hours sleep, and then wake up in the morning, get your breakfast at 5. 5:30
repeat.
go up and see the bloke who's just coming off shift, hand over, then do it again. Yeah.
Yeah, cool, mate. And when you're saying like measuring like the depth of the ocean, like surveying the seabed, how does that all work? Because I'm sure many people have like read about stuff being like in local residence here, like with the dredging of the bay when all that occurred and things like that. Like how does that whole process work?
Yeah, so most of the stuff that is used to measure things underwater and at sea, you use a lot of technology, which is a cool part of the job and something attracted me to it. Measuring anything under the water is mostly measured by sound.
Yep.
So sound travels really well through water compared to light or other things. So say like an echo sounder that we would use to measure the depth is exactly the same as a fish finder on my old man's fishing boat, right?
Right.
So it emits a sound of a certain frequency which goes down through the water column, bounces off the seabed, comes back up, and the echo sounder transmits the sound, then it listens for when the return comes back. And sound travels through seawater at a speed of about 1,500 metres a second. So if you're in 1,500 metres of water, it would take a second for that sound to go down and hit the bottom, then a second for that sound to come back up to the boat. And the echo sounder records that travel time, says, okay, I sent it, it's waiting. Okay, 2 seconds later, the sound comes back. It converts that travel time to a distance because it knows that we know the speed of sound through the water column. So that using acoustics or noise through water, you can do lots of things. So you can measure the depth. You can also measure distance to another object.
Right.
So you can send a sound to a diver who has a transponder on their helmet. That transponder will receive the sound and then send the sound back, send another ping back to the vessel, so we can measure how far away that diver is and where they are. And once you start doing that, then you can position anything underwater. You can tow things behind your vessel, or you can have remotely operated vehicles or autonomous vehicles that fly down. If you know where that object is all the time, then you can start to do a lot of things. It's basically using acoustics and using acoustics in different ways to map out the seabed.
Yeah, fascinating, mate. And is there been like moments where you're like, whoa, this is a lot deeper than we anticipated? Or is there like moments where you send off that echo and it, there's been an interference, you kind of hang on a second, what's going on there? Like, I assume there's a bit of problem solving involved
absolutely,
too.
Yeah. So that's probably one of the most frustrating parts of the job, and also one of the most rewarding. The frustrating parts is things go wrong, and they go wrong all the time, right?
Yep.
You're working in usually fairly remote locations. The weather conditions can be crappy, things get damaged, and you're working on noisy pieces of equipment. You're working on a ship and it's noisy, and you're trying to use this little ping of noise that you're sending through the water. You're trying to sit there and listen to that, or your equipment is anyway. Things do go wrong, and I guess part of the job is troubleshooting and understanding what's happening. So that's one thing I notice. The guys that we employ now are far less aware of how the equipment works and the theories behind it. I mean, they'd all understand that it's acoustics and that we need to measure the travel time and the speed of sound. But when something's not working, quite often, this is part of my job now, is we're troubleshooting with our teams and trying to work out what's happening. And you say, well, they say, the echo sounder, we ping it and nothing comes back, right? And first you can say, well, how deep do you think it is, right? Is it 2,000 metres and our equipment only works to 200 metres? They say, no, it's not 2,000 metres. Okay, well, what about the noise of the ship? Have you tried turning off the ship's echo sounder or the other equipment on the vessel? Have you tried operating with just one engine?
It's almost like IT troubleshooting.
It is, exactly, yeah. But the core part of it is that the guys or the people doing the work, they have to understand, look out the window and look at what they're on and what's happening around them, because it's these environmental factors that are contributing to the part of the problem. And it might be that it's too windy, right? There's too much waves and bubbles and turbulence in the water for the equipment to work. There's lots of things. And today's guys, I guess, what's happened over the years is that the equipment has become a bit like telephones, mobile phones, right? Things have become easier to use and more user-friendly. You don't have to think about how it works anymore. You just sort of press the button, turn it on, and, hey, it's working, right? And then when it doesn't work, you're like,
what the hell?
What happened here, right? I don't know how to fix it because I don't know how it works.
Yeah.
So I guess that's sort of part of what I do now is training our guys and making sure they understand how things work, because each job is slightly different. You're not always measuring just the depth of the water, right?
Yeah.
You might be measuring the depth of something that's buried beneath the seabed, right?
Yep.
Similar principle applies, but you've got to understand that, hey, the speed of sound through the water is different from the speed of sound through sand, or silt or whatever it is. So, that's the challenge now is getting people who come out of school or out of university to understand the theory behind the actual practical application.
Yeah, fascinating. Mate, when you've been at sea and working offshore, you sent me some notes before the podcast, and something that I gravitated towards was that less than 20% of our oceans have been mapped, and 71% of our Earth is covered with water. And has there been anything, that you've kind of gone bizarre that you've seen, or something that has just been we can't explain that? I'm just fascinated because often I hear interesting stories from people who either pilots or, and I'll be honest, I go looking for these types of things because I think there's more out there than what we really know. But yeah, just curious.
Yeah, there is. I mean, you're always. I'm sort of fascinated by looking at the contours of the seabed because it's a lot different than the contours of the land. The lands are generally pretty, smooth sloped and has been manicured and modified over time. But under the ocean, the seabed is a lot more diverse. So if you just look out through the even locally here at the Port of Melbourne through the Rip, through the heads at Port Phillip Bay, the seabed there is fascinating. That was my first job working for the Port of Melbourne, and there's this huge chasm that comes through the Rip that you never see it from the surface, right?
Yeah.
But when you start mapping it, particularly when you map it in detail, it's fascinating, and it goes from 12 metres deep down to 100 metres deep. It just drops off over a cliff. And not that I've been diving down there, but the divers who have been down there say it's just incredible. You go over the side of this cliff, there's kelp and corals and fish everywhere. There's definitely fascinating things. We've been working on projects around offshore installations, offshore drilling platforms. And our clients said, when you go there, make sure the gear that you take is manta ray resistant. You're like, what do you mean? I've never heard of manta ray resistant equipment, right? That doesn't say that on the brochure, right?
Yeah.
So there's heaps of manta rays around this platform. Okay, so we're aware of it. And you go out there, and I think we had an ROV, remotely operated vehicle, which is it's like a small car, I guess. Connected to the surface, to the boat by an umbilical or a cable, and we can fly it, drive it. It's got cameras on it. And the guys flying it, I mean, they really have some great stories because they actually see all the stuff that's flying. There's just these huge manta rays just gliding around it, coming right up to the ROV, totally harmless, right? But I guess if you run into one of them, it'll do some damage.
Yeah.
Seen a few things underwater, but probably the most memorable things that I've seen are actually above the water. So I was working in Indonesia and Southeast Asia for a lot of the time. And because you're on a boat, you're not really looking at what's under the water all the time. You might be looking at what's around you. And some of the coastlines and the river deltas we went down through, just absolutely incredible. And like people pay thousands of dollars to go on cruises and trips through these remote islands. And we were just doing it for as part of our day job, right?
Yeah.
There's been some great places I've seen as part of it, as well as seeing some strange things underwater as well.
Yeah, fascinating. Mate, I'd love you to shed a little bit of light on, the stuff we were talking about in the kitchen where, the dive team and because you were saying to me that they'll spend, was it up to a month underwater, and there's living quarters that are underwater and that was all that blew my mind. Once you told me that, I was thinking about that for a couple of days.
Yeah, that is a hardcore job, right? So, I mean, I'm a surveyor. We work on boats and we work with divers. I'm not a diver myself. And there's different levels of diving. So there's scuba diving like people do all over the place. When it comes to industrial or commercial diving, there's a couple of different techniques you use, but basically the difference is when you're a scuba diver, you've got a tank on your back and you're totally unconnected to the surface. In commercial diving, you're connected to the surface. You've got a dive helmet on. You're getting air from the surface. You've got communication with the surface. A lot of the, if you're diving with using breathing air from the surface, there's a limited range that you can go down to. So you can work down to about 45 or 50 metres.
Yep.
And the duration that you spend at that depth is really limited. You have to, I think if you're diving at 50 metres, you've only got sort of less than half an hour bottom time, and then you have to return to the surface. So if you're doing a task that takes 12 hours to do, and one diver can only be down there for half an hour, you've got to have a lot of divers that rotate through. So some of the projects we work on, which are beyond that sort of range that you can dive in to 45 or 50 metres, so 100 metres water depth, say, which we're doing a couple of projects like that now, we use saturation divers. So the divers live on the ship, obviously, but to work at those depths, they have to live in a pressurised environment. You can't sort of dive down to 100 metres, then come back up at the surface. You get, without any treatment, you get the nitrox, the bubbles, right?
Sure.
The bends, sorry.
Yep.
So the divers, when you're working beyond 50 metres, you need a specialist ship, a specialist piece of equipment with a saturation diving system. And the divers actually live in a pressurised chamber. So they'll come on board the vessel, on board the ship, do their briefings, understand what the tasks they're going to be doing over the next month are. And then they enter the living chambers, right? The living chambers is like a couple of big aluminium cans, right? And they have 9 or 12 guys or people living in them. They've got, bunks and TV and toilet and things like that. And when all the guys are in there ready to go, then the door gets closed, sealed up, and it starts to get pressurised. They get fed.
And they're adjusting to the pressure
gases,
while that,
So if they're working at, if the area where they need to work is, say, 100 metre deep, then slowly they'll get, it's called being blown down, they'll get the gases and the pressure will increase, and they'll get to 100 metres water depth pressure.
Yeah, wow.
And they get used to that for a while. But then they have to actually get, that's still on board the actual ship, right? So they're still sitting in this aluminium can on the deck of the ship, and then they have to get in the water. So they basically crawl through from their living chamber into a pressurised bell, and then the bell just looks like a bell, and it gets lowered down through the centre of the ship or over the side of the ship, and it gets lowered down with the guys in it. So they'll have typically three divers in the bell, sitting in the bell. Gets lowered down to 100 metres water depth. The bell's full of air still because the air can't get out, the gas can't get out through the top of the bell. And then when they're down at the working depths, one or two of the divers will swim out from the bell, enter the water, and start doing their task. Their task can be, could be cleaning. They'll be using some tools underwater, maybe removing bolts from pipelines, working with the crane and the other tools that the vessel has. So that the divers are very good because they've got hands and they can use specialised tools. Whereas if you're using a crane, it's just a hook that goes in the water. It can't do much. If you're using a remotely operated vehicle, it can do a few more things, but it can't do everything that a diver would do. So the divers will work down there for hours at a time. They come back into the bell, have a drink and a biscuit and a Tim Tam, and then go back out 100 metres below the surface, do their 8-hour shift, then come back up to the surface in the bell, crawl out of the bell through the pressurised spool or pipe back into the living chambers. Next lot of 3 divers come out of the living chambers into the bell, back down there and continue on.
Unbelievable, mate.
So yeah, they can do that. I think there's some really sort of stringent restrictions placed around how we operate with divers because it is quite a dangerous. It's much safer now than it ever was, but it can be dangerous if it's not done properly. So there's a lot of guidelines about how long the divers can work. I think 28 days is basically the maximum, and then they've got to come out out of the saturation living chambers. I think there's some requirements on how long they have to spend out of it before they can go back in there.
Yep.
So yeah, it's a pretty hardcore profession, right? And
Yeah.
you can imagine like going on a ship, like I was talking about at the start, and working for a couple of months. At least you can see you can see land, or you can walk out the back deck, or you can
Get some
walk
fresh
up
air.
the front of the deck, get some fresh air. You can imagine living 30 days in this living chamber, with 8 other guys or 10 other guys, and if you don't like one of them, it's not going to be very fun, right? It's a hardcore. But the guys who do it, they're very fit, very skilled, get paid well, and they have those benefits as well. As they work hard for their month or whatever it is, and then they come off and they've got nothing to do for the next one. Wait till the next time they've got to go back.
Yeah, fascinating. Mate, do you feel like before we hit record, you were talking about the blue economy concept. Can you share with listeners what that is? And because I've only heard about it a little bit briefly, but your take on it and what you believe will occur in the industry and into the future, and how we manage, I suppose, the next 30 odd years with the ocean and how important that is.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned before that around 80% of the world's oceans are unexplored, haven't been looked at, and I think the oceans cover like 70% of the world's surface, right? So if you do the maths, 80% of 70% is about 50% of the world hasn't really been explored, and it's not really being utilised for what it is, right? On land, we're farming, we're building cities, people are going to school, driving around, but half the world you can't do that, right? And so it hasn't really been developed so much. There's in some areas lots and lots of fishing, some areas a bit of tourism, some areas there's oil and gas being extracted from the ocean, but it hasn't really been harvested or used like we do onshore. So I think that's starting to change now, right? With particularly with renewable energy. So offshore wind is really starting to kick in throughout Europe, places like Taiwan, where they get lots of wind. There's lots of demand for energy, and people don't want wind turbines, in their backyard. That's all moving into the offshore space. So now there's wind turbines getting installed offshore, not too far from shore, but in 20 or 30 metres water depth, where it's not too deep, not too shallow. And some parts of Europe are generating heaps and heaps of their power through this renewable energy source. It hasn't kicked in Australia yet, but it's coming. In Gippsland, there's the Star of the South wind farm and some other concession areas being released, and the government's released some policies related to offshore wind, which is trying to develop the industry in Australia. So that will be a big change for Australia, and I think it's heading in the right direction, and that generates heaps of work for people like myself, mapping out where these things are going to go. What's the seabed look underneath the seabed? What's the sediment type? What's the currents?
That's ensuring less of an environmental impact as well, I'm assuming.
Well, that's right. Yeah. So there's a number of things that we would do in relation to the wind farm. So firstly, someone has to map out where are all the winds.
Yep.
Where are the good areas with lots of wind? Typically, the areas with lots of wind also got lots of big waves and big currents. So you've got to measure how big are the waves, when do they happen. Same with the currents, so that then engineers can design the structures to withstand the environmental forces.
Yep.
So there's the water, there's also the seabed as well. So what's the seabed made up of? A lot of areas of sort of the seabed's fine, soupy silt, which is not that great. Some areas it's really sandy or gravelly, or some areas it's rock. So there's a lot of work around that, and that's just to install the structures. Then there's all cables that go between them, and they have to be mapped out. Do they go across reefs? Can they be buried and protected? So there's a lot of work for surveyors that goes into planning and then constructing and then monitoring, inspecting wind farms over their lifespan. So that's one sort of part, probably the biggest one that'll happen in the blue economy. Other ones is like underwater mining. So that's starting to take off in some areas, particularly in areas like Papua New Guinea and the Pacific. We've been working on some projects where our clients are looking for nodules, like sort of balls of minerals that have collected over millions of years.
Specifically for like renewables and
yeah. So the minerals, and don't quote me, I'm not an expert in renewable minerals, but the minerals that they're getting are quite hard to find on land.
Yeah, interesting.
But they're actually sort of accumulating in areas of the ocean where all the sediment sort of ends up, right? If it's heavier sediment, it all sort of comes together. The currents roll it all together, and then it collects, right? Like the Cook Islands is one area where there's huge areas of known, I think they're called polymetallic nodules or something like that. I'm not sure what minerals in them, but it's very valuable, very rare, and very difficult to get from it's 5,000 metres beneath the ocean. But if you can work out a way to get that, find it and get it back up to the surface, it's really valuable. And that stuff's used in computer parts and batteries for EV cars.
Cobalt and all
that's the stuff, yeah.
Yep.
So that sort of thing is really starting to take off. And along with that is also people are now very much more aware of, protecting the oceans, the impacts that if you install a wind farm or collecting minerals off the seabed, the impacts that can have on the fish life, and then how that impacts fishermen and local communities. So the other part of it is then making sure that it's done responsibly and sustainably. And that generates work as well, right? People have to map out what is actually on the seabed there before someone comes in and sucks all the minerals out of it, and then monitors what they're doing, making sure that it's not impacting things and they're complying with all the regulations and requirements.
Yeah.
So over the next 30 years, I think there'll be a big a big change, and there'll be a lot more work in the offshore sector. Traditionally, it's been fishing, tourism, oil and gas. But renewables, particularly renewable energy, will make up a big part of it going forward.
Yeah, fascinating. What do you think will be, because AI is starting to disrupt a lot of industries, are you seeing it play out in your space? Because I'm assuming technology advances very quickly in your space with how we go about measuring and gaining data. Mm-hmm. What's something that you've noticed recently, or something that you think is going to happen with the impact of AI and as that evolves?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure if you'd class it as AI. I guess it is. But what has happened in the industry in probably the last 2 or 3 years, it happened before this, but now has really started to take hold, is the use of unmanned vessels. So even big ships, 50, 60 metre long, they're being built now to be unmanned and controlled remotely.
Yeah, wow.
So they're not, this is the AI part of it. They can be autonomous, so you can set the vessel to go on a mission. We want to, go from point A to point B. When you get to point B, deploy this sensor here, turn it on, activate it, start recording data, and we're going to go point C, then point D, and then when you get to point E, recover the sensor and stop recording.
Yep.
So we're doing that now. We have a couple of unmanned vessels that are being piloted from control centres in different parts of the world, and that's a really cool thing. And that is I'm not sure whether it is going to be there for the long term. The idea behind it is that you have less people working offshore.
Yep.
People don't have to be away from their friends and family for months at a time. It's safer if they're working in an office than if they're on a ship.
Does that eliminate? I'm assuming that eliminates like human error as well, with like potential accidents and things like that. And I don't know too much about the space, but I feel like whenever there's like a ship or something that has had an accident, it's like in the news, and
absolutely,
there's always like a potential for human error.
So that's the big driver, right? Whether the cause of the incident is human error or some other factor, it doesn't really matter. But the impact is that people get injured, people might lose their lives, and if that happens, that particularly the big customers, all customers, I guess it impacts, but our big customers, your Exxon Mobil's and Shell's and Chevron and Woodside sort of companies, they take any injury to any person incredibly serious. And if there's any way that they can reduce the risk of people getting injured, working in a it's not it's not exactly the safest environment. It is a safe environment, but it does have its hazards. So if there's any way that they can reduce the risk to people working on their projects, then they'll do it.
Yep.
It does come at a cost, I think, and that's where the industry's grappling with at the moment. Is this, you would think that, okay, we're not going to have people working offshore anymore. Should cost us less, right? But it's cost someone millions of dollars to develop this technology, and that needs to be paid back. So it's not necessarily a cost saving, but it's a saving in terms of a reduction of risk. It becomes a cost saving when you have multiple vessels going out there. So if you've got 5 unmanned vessels, they can still all be sort of controlled by the same team that would operate one manned vessel offshore. And that is starting to happen. So that's probably the biggest thing. For us, as our company, we're starting to get into it. We realise that is the way forward. Not everything can be done with an unmanned vessel. There's lots of things that require people's hands to get in there and fix things. And like I was saying before, things always go wrong, or they come loose, or job tasks change when you're offshore. So having people on board is still going to happen in the future, but I think it'll probably happen, be reduced going forward.
Yeah, fascinating, mate. That's so interesting. Like I find, I was listening. I was at a conference last year actually, and there was someone talking about just the future of aviation, and there's going to be unmanned flight control towers soon, and I just assumed like it's a similar kind of vein, like when there's a machine unmanned, and there's specific programs that you can develop in order for it to be more effective, safer.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a fascinating time that we live in.
Yeah, I guess that would in aviation, and some of the errors are from human errors, and you will be able to, and I'm sure people are already doing it, training the software so that the error rate, whereas previously might have been 1%, is now 0.0001%. So it will happen, and it'll affect not just our industry, but aviation and all sorts of things. Yeah,
mate. In terms of skill sets, so what I've been hearing from your journey, like maths, science, critical problem solving, analytical thinking, being able to like observe your surroundings and kind of put them all together to develop a solution. What are some other skill sets that you think are really important for people wanting to get into the industry, or mindsets as well?
Yeah, so I think probably the biggest one that I'd take away is that when you're working on these work sites, which are remote, you're working with a team. You're very rarely, never, I would say, working by yourself, right?
Yep.
So firstly, you have to be able to work in a team, and you have to be happy working in a team. The other thing that happens if you're working, like I was saying before, if you're in a saturation diving living chamber with 10 other people and you don't get along with them, it's not going to be very fun, right? So you've got to be able to get along with people, understand that everyone's different, and they may have a different background for you. It's the offshore industry, whether you're a surveyor or a diver or sailor, whatever it is a global industry, and so you're quite often working on a job site you might be the only Australian on the job site, right? Well, you could be on another one where there's 100, everyone's Australian. But quite often you're working with people from Europe, the Americas, Southeast Asia, wherever, and everyone's got to get along. They may all speak different languages. They've all got different backgrounds. You're getting paid differently. But getting along and working as a team and putting your differences aside, that's probably the most critical thing. And in touch wood, we've been fairly lucky. The people that we employ, realise that and are pretty good natured and get along with people. But you do get occasions where someone will come on a job and they'll cause piss everyone off, right?
Yep.
And you've got to get rid of the guy from the job site, right?
Yep.
If we don't get rid of this guy, he might be great at his job, but he just can't get along with everyone.
Yeah. So those soft skills that...
Yeah, it's the soft skills, right? The technical stuff is good and it's great to have that. But when you're working on these job sites, which are pretty remote, and you can't go home at the end of the day and chill out, or go for a run and blow it all off or anything, you've got to be able to manage yourself and make sure that you get along with people, you don't upset people. You're living in these facilities, you've got to keep things clean and tidy and consider all the other people around you on these work sites. Yeah, that's probably the main thing, I think.
Yeah, good insight. And mate, now that you've transitioned in your own role, what does your day-to-day look like and your current role?
Yeah, so now, like I mentioned before, I don't really go offshore anymore. I haven't since about I don't know, 2014, something like
Yep.
that. So it's been about 10 years. And my day now is sort of overlooking our group. So I look over our group of companies and the survey operations with all those groups. So we have company in Malaysia, company in Indonesia, operations in Australia, Papua New Guinea, Middle East, and we've got survey teams working in all those locations and other locations as well. So my role now is sort of we get reports in from all those vessels, ships working all over the place each day, looking at those reports, checking everything's okay there. Sometimes things are not okay, and we'll get a phone call in the middle of the night or email saying, this thing's not working, I can't fix it. Got any ideas? So some of it's technical support. Some of it is, most of it actually is like talking to clients, drumming up work, and putting proposals together to solve clients' problems, using the experience that we've had, working all over the place. A client will come to you and say, we've got this, we want to build a power plant on a river in Papua New Guinea. What information do we need, right? And so probably need a bit of this. You need some currents, and you need some rainfall data, and you'll need some bathymetry, and we can do parts of it. Some parts of it you'll need to go to another company to get their advice. So that's probably takes up 70% of my work nowadays. It's probably 70% commercial and proposals and business development, and 30% is sort of a bit more technical. I guess when we started our company, I was sort of like quite the technical one. Actually, we founded our company with 3 people, and we're all pretty technical.
Yep.
We didn't have an accounts guy or a marketing person, and that's where we really struggled. We missed those skills. We were all great technically, great at talking, great at convincing someone we knew what we were doing, but and when you're a technical person, you just want to go out there and do that job, right?
Yep.
And you forget, hang on, I've got to get paid for it. I've got to put an invoice in. I've got to make sure I follow their invoice submission procedure, and then you might do all that, and you still got to get paid as well, right? And chasing up clients to pay you, another part of the job, which still unfortunately we have to do, that probably takes up 10% of the time as well. Yeah.
Do you find, just curious, because I often find my biggest clients are the longest to pay.
Absolutely, yeah.
Hey, mate, thanks so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate it. A little segment that we ask all of our guests is the what are you roaring about? So I'll play Danny's theme music.
Taco. I'm roaring.
So, Dave, what's making you roar at the moment, mate?
Probably the simple things in my life, right? I spent 13 years living overseas and running around like a headless chicken, travelling and pretty hectic. And now I'm back here in Mornington. I sort of tend to enjoy and make the most and get the most enjoyment out of little things that are happening. So like just this morning, actually, just looked at my back lawn and it's absolutely magnificent. Right, it just had a couple of days of rain. It is, and I watered it and fertilised it a couple of weeks ago. So take a little bit of pride in the back lawn, and
Fantastic.
it is looking magnificent. The kids love it.
Ready for backyard cricket season.
Ready for a bit of backyard cricket season, yeah. And that's it. I'll keep reminding my wife about it. Gee, that lawn looks good, doesn't it? She's like, yeah, I've seen it all before. The little things like that, I guess that gets me going. My kids, I just taught my kids to ride their bike, and little things like that, watching them work out how to do it, that sort of gets you going. And I guess as you get older and a bit more mature, you're not so, what gets you roaring is not work stuff, it's those little things that make you happy personally, or watching your kids do something, seeing them achieve something,
Yeah, fantastic, mate. Is there a way that people can learn more about Bintang Subsea and was it Shelf Sea as well?
Yeah, sure.
Subsea?
So Bintang Subsea is our company that does the surveying work. So we have a LinkedIn page, our Instagram page as well. So you can search for those. And Shelf Subsea is our sort of parent company, and those guys handle all the diving and the bigger projects for our group. Shelf Subsea also have a LinkedIn page, and jump on it and see what's happening.
Yeah, perfect. Mate, thanks so much for coming on.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate it.